Thucydides is considered by many to be the most reliable historian of antiquity. But what does objective mean in practice? Can we trust an Athenian who writes about the Athens War? And what happens when he admits that at certain points he put words into the mouths of his protagonists? In this video, we won't see if Thucydides is objective. We'll see if he is historically reliable and what that really means. To answer this question, we must first look at the world in which he wrote. Thucydides does not record the Peloponnesian War from a distance, nor from a neutral position. He writes at a time when Athens is at the height of its power and at the same time on the threshold of the conflict that will lead to its decline. We need to understand the historical context in which both the war and Thucydides' own historical thinking took place. So this is where we start. After the Persian Wars, Athens was the only one that continued to fight against the Persians. She won a series of victories at sea against the Persians that secured her spoils and access to important sea passages. Athens, using mainly force, forced several cities to either join the Delian League or remain in it. The transfer of the alliance treasury from Delos to Athens sealed the transformation of the alliance into an Athenian hegemony. A series of Athenian reforms further democratized the regime, while at the same time the Athenians created a large body of literature and erected many public buildings, making their city particularly beautiful. Athens at that time developed into the intellectual and artistic center of Greece. Thucydides lived in this city. Politically, he was a moderate democrat, although an admirer of Pericles. He began writing his work from the moment the Peloponnesian War broke out. In 424 BC, when he was an admiral, he was exiled from Athens on the grounds that he failed to save Amphipolis from the Spartans, a fact which the historian and former admiral reports without emotion. Thucydides claims that exile helped him gather material from both sides of the conflict and assess the events calmly. When the war ended, he returned to Athens, but he did not have time to finish his work, the narrative of which is interrupted in 411 because he passed away in 399 BC. Let us first examine a specific passage from the epitaph. Thucydides, through this speech, delivered by Pericles for the first dead of the war, eloquently presents the Athenian ideal. However, as we will see below, there are some contradictions between certain aspects mentioned in the epitaph speech and what was in fact true. First of all, Pericles calls the Athenian regime a democracy, arguing that the administration is in the hands of the many. However, these many referred to in the text are the citizens of Athens and the only ones who had political rights. To be a citizen, one had to be an adult, free Athenian male. This definition of citizen by default excludes other social groups, such as slaves, settlers, women and children, the total number of whom is said to have exceeded that of citizens. It is worth noting that the settlers were obliged to pay taxes and perform military service. All of this led the historian Gustav Glotz to characterize the Athenian regime as a type of aristocracy. It should also be mentioned that a large number of citizens, although they had the right to participate in the work of the municipal church, abstained from these for various reasons. Peasants, loggers, small traders and others, either due to the distance or due to workload, usually preferred to remain in their remote homes. Some things should be mentioned regarding the issue of equality, which concerned the Athenian assemblies. The right of all citizens to freedom of expression did not imply the ability to express structured political discourse. We may read in the epitaph that everyone in their public career depended on their individual worth and not on their social class. But it is true that social class played a decisive role in the political career of the Athenians. Those who had the financial means to pay a sophist advanced politically because rhetoric played a major role in the people's decision-making. These are just a few indicative examples. It is possible that the reader will get the impression that Thucydides is deliberately making propaganda in favor of Athens. However, in the second book of his history, he states that the democracy of that period was a democracy in name only, and that in reality it was the rule of one man, Pericles. He managed to impose himself on the people with his argumentation and rhetorical skill, rather than being guided by them. This admission, besides being a strong advocate for his credibility, also reveals a contradiction in his work, which, however, is explained if we separate the epitaph from his history. The first text has a propaganda character. It is uttered by a politician, Pericles, in order to mobilize the Athenians in the war effort. The second is a historical text. It is governed by different rules and was created under different circumstances. Let us now look at the issue of Athenian imperialism. Thucydides devotes a large part of his work to Athenian foreign policy. He seems to understand that Athens' extensive sea power was based on naval supremacy, maritime trade, but also on the exploitation of allied cities and the repression of those who wanted to leave the alliance. He also transmits the operations of repression. He does not conceal, when he reproduces a speech by Cleon in the assembly of the city, that Athenian politics was anti-democratic.
You do not consider that the power you exercise is a tyranny that you impose on people who plot against you and do not want it. On people who obey you, not because you do them favors, harming your interests, but because your strength and not their friendship and loyalty secures you power.
The injustices committed by Athens do not seem to have particularly concerned Thucydides, nor do the benefits that Athens offered its allies. Later writers, such as Isocrates and Lysias, claimed that the Athenian policy also had some benefits for its allies, such as the ability to live independently of Persian policy in non-tyrannical regimes, enjoying goods and pleasures similar to those of Athens. Demagories are speeches that, according to Thucydides, were delivered by various men of the time, politicians or military men, either on the eve of or during war. It is believed that they attempt to assess the predictions that were made. The question that arises is whether they are authentic or reflect the historian's views. He states that it was difficult to accurately reproduce both those he heard and those that others had heard and communicated to him. Ask yourself if you could record on paper with 100% accuracy a speech you hear without the ability of recording it with modern means. That is why he wrote them, taking into account what the orators would naturally say, which would be most appropriate to the occasion, and following, as far as possible, the general meaning of what they actually said. In this case, we must approach each demagoria separately. If the demagoria was heard by himself, then we can take it into account, subject, however, to its verification. Otherwise, the demagoria can be taken into account, but with reduced validity. There is a number of questions we can ask in order to test the credibility of a historian. The first is whether he has an interest in lying. However, as has been pointed out, we need to think carefully, not what interest we would have in lying if we were in his position, but what interest he or his environment would have. In this case, one could claim that Thucydides is reproducing inaccuracies in favor of his homeland, Athens, or his own person. As mentioned, he was a general in 424 BC when he failed to save Amphipolis from the Peloponnesians. Here we can object that Thucydides was exiled by his own fellow citizens because of his failure, which, moreover, he reports without emotion or a particularly apologetic mood. However, one could object that the historian wrote his history to please the Athenian public, with the aim of his return to Athens, which indeed happened after the end of the war, around 403 BC. However, as already mentioned, Thucydides did not conceal the exploitation of the allied cities by Athens, nor the fact that its policy was unpopular. Others might be tempted to accuse him of writing the history that Pericles would have liked best, and it is clear that the Athenian statesman is presented more prudent than his successors. However, Pericles died in August 429 during a plague, while Thucydides continued writing his work until 399. The way in which he presents the deepest cause of the Peloponnesian War may give rise to some to say that he shifts the responsibility for the war to the Spartans.
The real, of course, but unacknowledged cause was, as I think, that the great growth of Athens frightened the Spartans and forced them to fight.
However, if we read a later chapter, it will be possible to form the impression that Thucydides is blaming the Spartans for not starting the war sooner. During an assembly in Sparta, on the eve of the war, the Corinthians, addressing the Spartans, said, according to him, the following:
"For all this, the fault is yours. First of all, you allowed them, after the Persian Wars, to strengthen their state, to build the long walls and to deprive of their freedom not only all the subjects whom they have enslaved, but now also your own allies. The real responsible is not the one who enslaves, but the one who, while he can prevent the enslavement, is indifferent even though he wants to have the reputation of being the liberator of Greece."
Thucydides has been accused of ignoring the economic factor. As an example, he has given little importance to the issue of Athens' food supply with wheat, which contributed decisively to the maintenance of its poor citizens, and for which the Athenians took measures to secure the roads for the great granaries of Pontus. But Thucydides does not seem to ignore other important economic factors. Amphipolis, which he himself failed to save from the Spartans, was a very important source of timber for the Athenian ships and of financial income. Similarly, when the historian refers to the involvement of the Athenians in the conflict between Syracuse and Leontini, he clearly refers to the economic factor.
The Athenians sent their ships, openly declaring that they did so because they had a common origin with the Leontini, but in reality because they wanted to prevent the supply of grain to the Peloponnese from Sicily.
Based on the above, we could draw some initial conclusions. From the way he presents Athenian democracy, it follows that the information he provides us is not fully reliable, which means that when the epitaph, a political text, is used as a historical source, it must be approached with particular caution. Thucydides is considered more reliable in his history, which is evident from the way he refers to issues such as Athenian imperialism, the causes of the war, his failure at Amphipolis, and the economic factor. The above does not mean, however, that his work should be approached without any reservations. Thucydides may have lived at that time and participated in some events of the war, but he did not have direct information about everything that took place during the Peloponnesian War. Therefore, the epistemological question of how accurate is the information he transmits arises. Did his sources know the truth? If so, did they really want to tell it? If they really wanted to tell it, were they able to, or did they have difficulty? Thucydides refers to this issue when he talks about the demagogues. He also does not seem to justify why he reaches the conclusion he does each time, why one opinion or piece of information is more valid than another. In any case, nothing in history is taken for granted. Sources, whether primary or secondary, did not fall like manna from heaven, and therefore we must examine them with a critical attitude.